and I'm an intern for ADAO. Welcome to our 11th Zoom conversation, the Global Asbestos Fight for Human Rights and Justice. We'll get started officially in just a few moments, and in the meantime, we're asking everyone to please mute themselves and turn off your camera for the duration of the conversation. To maximize the amount of information we'll be sharing, only the speakers will be using the video function and microphone. If you have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be moderating that. And look out for a recap email after today's conversation. I am excited to introduce our four speakers: Linda Reinstein, co-founder and president of ADAO; Silvana Mosano, journalist and community advocate, and Alec will be helping to translate for Silvana; Barry Castleman, environmental consultant and author; and Gopal Krishna, founder of Ban Asbestos Network of India. Today we are discussing how asbestos in the industry impacts human rights and civil justice around the globe. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to ADAO's co-founder, Linda Reinstein.
Thank you, Sarah. It is great that interns take what we do so seriously. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our 11th Zoom conversation. If you see, my eyes go back and forth in the sense of what we're doing. This is a manual operation. We don't hire out, and it's very tricky. So we have Silvana from Italy, and fortunately for us, Alec from Canada will be her translator, because I regretfully don't speak Italian. So knowing that, we'll be a little gentle in how we do our live streaming. I'm disappointed, but I completely understand. We have two speakers that are unable to join us today, and that is Fernanda Giannassi from Brazil and Professor Ghoshi from India. So they send their regrets, but we have a lot of information from them. So Barry and I will supplement the conversation to make sure Brazil is represented well. And I know Gopal is going to do an amazing job. So that's going to make our work a little bit easier. And for those of you who haven't met me or been familiar with ADAO, we're an independent nonprofit dedicated to education, advocacy, and community. For 17 years, we have been working with unions, health and scientists. Arthur Frank just joined this conversation, leading scientists like Dr. Castleman, Dr. Frank, and so many others, to move and shape policy to ban asbestos, to prevent human rights violations, and of course, promote civil justice. Most people in the United States probably still have a misconception of what asbestos is. So we hope that you'll return to our website and recognize that we have some terrific materials that you can share. I saw Mavis joining this conversation. Mavis, IOSH, and many others have materials to help prevent exposure to eliminate all asbestos-caused diseases. And we're honored that there are three sponsors that recognize our work is important. Our highest level sponsor is Platinum, and that's Simmons Hanley Conroy, and they've been supporting our work for over a decade. This year, we welcome the Gorey Law Firm, who are terrific. They come in at a gold level, and we're excited to welcome them and thank them for believing in ADAO's core work. And the silver sponsor is Early, Lucarelli, Sweeney, and Meisenkoten, and they have been sponsors for many years of our work. So we are grateful to have sponsors that recognize that we in the United States, ADAO, are really trying to make change happen. It's important to recognize we do not make legal referrals. So these law firms recognize that our work is terrific. They'll support us, but they do not get anything back. That is the only part of a slideshow that you are going to see. And we are going to start with self-introductions. So Barry, would you begin giving us a brief introduction? We're going to go around the circle here.
I'm Barry Castleman. I'm a public health worker in the United States. I've worked with people all over the world in trying to deal with the asbestos problem for the last 50 years. I've written a book about the history, the public health and corporate history of asbestos, called Asbestos: Medical and Legal Aspects. And I continue to work with people around the world to try and raise awareness and reduce the toll of asbestos.
Thank you, Barry. Silvana, would you please introduce yourself, and it will be translated by Alec from Canada.
Allora, io sono una giornalista da oltre 40 anni e per più di 30, fino al 2020, ho lavorato per il quotidiano La Stampa. Come cronista mi sono occupata spesso di questioni legate all'amianto. A Casale Monferrato, la città dove vivo, nel nord, che conta oggi circa 32.000 abitanti, è stato operativo per 80 anni, dal 1906 al 1986, il più grande stabilimento Eternit in Italia, dove si producevano manufatti contenenti amianti, per lo più tetti, grandi tubazioni che venivano impiegate per esempio nella rete dell'acquedotto. Per queste tubazioni in particolare veniva utilizzato l'amianto blu, cioè la crocidolite, la più terribile e il più cancerogena. Durante la mia professione mi sono occupata, per quanto riguarda l'amianto, di vicende sindacali, tra cui la lunga e difficile battaglia per ottenere nel 1992 la legge che vieta l'uso di amianto in Italia, di vicende politiche, tra cui l'ordinanza dell'allora sindaco Riccardo Coppo, che nel 1987 vietò a Casale l'uso di amianto con 5 anni di anticipo rispetto alla legge nazionale.
Silvana, forse sarebbe meglio adesso facciamo solo le introduzioni.
Ok,
così,
va bene.
Aspetta un momento. So I'm going to translate just the generalities. Silvana is a journalist just retired from La Stampa, which is a major Italian paper. She was a journalist for 40 years. She spent a lot of her career covering the asbestos issue, and she was explaining a little bit of the background on Casale Monferrato, the epicenter of asbestos exposure in Italy, really in Europe. Terrible exposures that have led to terrible health impacts for the people there, for the workers. And she's explaining how far back it went, that the factory was there for almost a century. And it exposed both the workers and the environment. And she'll be presenting some more details as we get into the actual presentations.
Thank you, Alec. Gopal, could you please turn your camera on, unmute yourself, and introduce yourself to everyone?
I'm Gopal Krishna. I work with Ban Asbestos Network of India. I've been working for last 20 years. I began as a journalist writing about the asbestos case which was going on in WTO appellate body, and the work has been continuing. We have succeeded partly getting asbestos mining banned in India, asbestos waste trade banned in India, but it is only half a step. Import, manufacture and use of asbestos continues in India, and more of it I will share later on during my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gopal. Fernanda is unable to join us, but we would definitely want to at least mention her amazing work. I'll start, Barry can fill in. Fernanda is one of the leading advocates in the world who's been fighting for over 3 decades to ban asbestos, not only in her country of Brazil, but she supports efforts in every country. She was a labor inspector for decades. She's now retired, but that doesn't mean you can find Fernanda on the beach. Barry's smiling. She remains as active as ever. And Fernanda has, like ADAO and probably Gopal and of course Italy, we blend our advocacy with both legal and legislative strategies and of course information. Fernanda is one of the activists I know that has actually taken her fight to the streets to the point where she has actually wrongly been arrested and spent a night, I think, in jail. Barry, what would you like to add about Fernanda, because she's an amazing woman?
Well, Fernanda has experienced every form of intimidation imaginable and trying to deal with the asbestos problem in Brazil, up to and including death threats. But for 30 years, she was a labor inspector, and she was able to retire without being fired, even though there were numerous attempts to get her fired from her job as well. And she's just a very courageous figure who's widely respected around the world for the work that she's done.
Yeah, I consider her one of my sisters in the fight. She is an amazing woman. So we regret that she can't share from Brazil, but lucky for you folks, Barry has been involved with Fernanda's Brazilian work for decades, and Fernanda brought me in about 15 years ago. So I think we can still engage in the discussion about human rights violation in Brazil and also what they're doing to seek justice. Let's move on with the conversation. We have a wide audience. So briefly, I would like very much, Barry, did you make an introduction? You did make an introduction. Barry, could you talk a little bit about human rights violations in the United States, what you know and how you're using your knowledge?
Well, the background of the asbestos industry is that it was largely built on the failure to warn people about the lethality of asbestos. If people working with asbestos had been told what was known about the dangers of asbestos, and I mean back in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, we would no longer have a problem that we have today because asbestos would have been replaced with something safer much earlier than it was. The hazards were recognized over 100 years ago. A 1918 government report said that the insurance companies were refusing to sell life insurance to asbestos workers because they were recognized as being excessively dangerous. Their job, their employment was dangerous. This is interesting that the word asbestosis hadn't appeared in a medical journal and the insurance companies had already picked it up. And then asbestosis, the lung scarring disease, well established in the 1930s. By the end of the 1930s, the German government was compensating lung cancer as an occupational disease of asbestos workers. Mesothelioma strongly associated with asbestos by 1960, and yet 80% of the asbestos used in the last century occurred after 1960. The hazards of asbestos were rather thoroughly discussed in 1964 at a major conference in New York. The conference proceedings run to over 700 pages, organized by the legendary Dr. Irving Selikoff. And there it was recognized that not only occupational exposure, but neighborhood exposure and household contact exposure to the family members of the people exposed to asbestos on the job were occurring, that these rare cancers caused by asbestos were occurring from environmental exposures as well as occupational exposures. And the serious regulation of asbestos didn't really begin until 1970 in the United States and in other countries. Here, with the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1970 and 1971. And the same thing was happening around the world, is that in Europe and in other parts of the world, governments were starting to get serious about regulating asbestos. The world peak of asbestos use was in 1978 at 5 million tons a year. It's now down to 1 million, and still very high volume amount of asbestos used. Most of it's used in Asia. And it's really, this is a criminal industry. There's no other way of describing it. The World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization have been calling for a ban on asbestos globally since 2006. So that's just sort of a background. And it's clearly a human rights matter that you've got companies using every dirty trick in the book to sell asbestos. Most of it comes from Russia and Kazakhstan, and the Russians have used trade pressures as well to coerce Thailand, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka to try and stop them from banning asbestos.
Thank you, Barry. And Barry has a 900-page book that we will link to in the wrap-up blog. He is one of the leading experts in the United States and around the world. Arthur Frank is also on, and I'm honored to work with both gentlemen in the capacity of it in their science advisory capacity for ADAO. Gopal, can you tell us briefly about your work in Bihar and India and what you're doing to prevent and end human rights violations and also protect civil justice? And Gopal, your camera's off. There we go. Thank you.
In India, the anti-asbestos struggle can be traced to trade union movement in Jharkhand, where a trade union leader for the first time brought the issue of hazards and asbestos-related diseases being causing deaths among workers in Jharkhand, which was undivided Bihar. In later years, it was one lawyer from Gujarat, Rani Advani, who pursued the case in the Supreme Court of India, where the petitioner was the Consumer Education Resource Center. And in that case, the Supreme Court of India heard the matter at length and came out with a judgment in January 1995. It has been 26 years of the judgment of the Supreme Court of India, but none of its 6 directions have been implemented as yet. And it is significant that this judgment referred to right to life while adjudicating in the matter of asbestos exposure. And this is the judgment in India which recognized for the first time that right to health is part of right to life. And the 6 directions of the Supreme Court, one among them is quite prominent, is that it said that state governments and central governments should update their laws, rules, regulations in keeping with fresh resolution of International Labour Organization. For several years, more than some 20 years, we have been reaching out to different departments in Government of India and in the state governments to ensure that they comply with the Supreme Court of India, directions of the Supreme Court of India. And one direction which is crucial in our struggle, which we are using in our campaigns, is that in 2006, International Labour Organization passed a resolution. Subsequently, a similar resolution was passed even by World Health Organization, which stated that for elimination of asbestos-related diseases, all kinds of asbestos needs to be phased out. It needs to be prohibited, including the white chrysotile asbestos. What one is witnessing these days in India, that now that supplier, the asbestos, global asbestos producers like Canada, Brazil have banned asbestos. The advertisements from the asbestos industry in India is referring to their product not as asbestos, but as imported fiber. And this imported fiber terminology, which is being used by the Asbestos Cement Products Manufacturers Association, which is a cartel of some 18 asbestos products manufacturers. This cartel is saying that Indians are now using imported fiber, what it is hiding. And it is actually an exercise in fraudulent misrepresentation by the industry, by this cartel. This observation that they are using imported fiber hides the fact that it is imported because asbestos production, asbestos mining in India has been banned. And it has been banned explicitly on the ground of its deleterious impact on human health. This ban has been repeated time and again when the question is raised in Parliament. Every time Government of India informs the Parliament that because of harmful effect of asbestos, all kinds of asbestos, the ban is not going to be lifted. What one is finding these days, at least in the last 2 years, subsequent to the pandemic engulfing everybody, is that while Government of India recognizes the recommendations of World Health Organization with regard to COVID-19, it refuses to recognize WHO's recommendations for elimination of asbestos-related diseases. And asbestos continues to be treated as if it's a nutrient element. Some 21% of the asbestos, some 350,000 tons of asbestos is being imported in India. And a large chunk of it is coming from Russia. And another large chunk is coming from Brazil, which is 21% of the 350,000 tons of imported asbestos in India. And it is not even being recognized by Government of India and also state governments that Brazilian Supreme Court has banned asbestos. Use of asbestos has been considered to be unconstitutional in Brazil. So the Brazilian Supreme Court has found it to be harmful for the Brazilian citizens, but it appears that the Brazilian Supreme Court does not consider it harmful for human beings in other countries like India.
Gopal, Gopal, that is such a great, deep view of what's happening in India. I do want to circle back with the students in Bihar, but I want to first go to Silvana, please. Silvana, you have, as a journalist and as an asbestos victim, deep ties to the wonderful work in Casale. Can you tell me what you're doing in Casale and throughout Italy to raise awareness, protect human rights, and of course, fight for justice?
So, spiego per Italiano. I'm going to explain for Silvana just very briefly. Silvana, Linda ha fatto una domanda, e la domanda è per lei di spiegare un po' della storia e l'importanza della lotta e delle sofferenze di Casale Monferrato e dove siamo adesso e l'importanza globale di questa lotta. E chiedo che fa un paragrafo e lasciami un momento per tradurre, e così non avremo bisogno di fare una traduzione lunga. Farò un sommario di ogni paragrafo del tuo discorso. Grazie.
Va bene. Allora, nella mia città, Casale Monferrato, come ho già detto, è stato attivo per 80 anni uno stabilimento Eternit, dove si facevano dei manufatti contenenti amianto. L'Eternit è stato, e lo è ancora in alcune zone del mondo, uno dei colossi industriali che impiegano l'amianto in modo massiccio nella loro produzione. C'erano anche stabilimenti in Europa e c'era in Italia, e per diversi decenni l'Eternit è stato di proprietà della famiglia svizzera Schmidaini. L'ultimo patrone in vita è Stefano Schmidaini, che ha poco più di 70 anni e ha gestito direttamente lo stabilimento di Casale tra il 1976 e il 1986, quando è stato chiuso. Alex, vuoi?
I'm going to make a little farò un sommario e c'è un cane qualche parte. So Silvana's explained that the struggle in Casale Monferrato stems from a very large asbestos cement factory, I think the largest in Europe, or certainly one of the largest, with around 2,000 employees, that was there from the early 20th century until the late 1980s. And it's an extraordinary situation because the owner, the family that owned the factory, one of their family members, a family named Schmidaini, actually managed that factory from the 1970s to the 1980s when it closed. So he had direct knowledge of everything that was going on there, which he hid from the workers and the community. And that is really what this trial is all about, okay?
Fino al 1992 lavorare l'amianto in Italia era lecito. Che cos'è che però si contesta a Schmidaini? Che lui sapeva che l'amianto era cancerogeno e ha fatto una propaganda per nasconderlo. Soprattutto ha consentito che la fibra di amianto, che è cancerogena, si diffondesse dentro la fabbrica e anche fuori dalla fabbrica, nella città. Tanto è vero che oggi quasi tutte le vittime di amianto, cioè che si ammalano del cancro di amianto, cioè il mesotelioma, sono cittadini che non hanno mai lavorato nella fabbrica, ma hanno respirato la fibra diffusa in maniera irresponsabile nell'aria della città.
Silvana's explaining that this large factory didn't just expose the workers, but it recklessly exposed the members of the community all around by releasing massive amounts of asbestos fiber essentially into the air. And in fact, the majority of the current victims who are the subject of this trial that's going on in Novara were actually environmental victims who never stepped inside that factory and never breathed the air inside the factory. They were exposed environmentally. So this is a real model for the world, unfortunately, of the combined terrible impact of asbestos, which is not just to workers, but to the broader environment in many circumstances.
Yeah, that's quite important. I want to circle back to justice in a few minutes. Can I move on? Is that, yeah? So I want to touch on human rights violations in the United States. When Alan, my late husband, was first diagnosed with mesothelioma, we had never really thought about asbestos being in our water, air, soil, environment, workplace. We truly thought our country had banned asbestos. We were wrong. Like Eudice, who I see on this call, and I know Mavis is a patient, and there are other asbestos victims, we find out the hard way that our human rights have been violated by the asbestos industry. In the United States, we stopped mining asbestos in 2002 in California. And as Barry remarked, we've known for over 100 years that asbestos exposure would cause disease, suffering, and most times death. That being said, Barry, Arthur, and others, Ellen, who's a board member on this chat, we've been working for 17 years to ban asbestos, to stop the imports and use through the EPA, which has nothing to do, although we believe in preventing cosmetic exposure, our focus is to stop the raw asbestos imports. Last year alone, as Gopal touched on, but Barry, you and I would circle this one, the United States imported 300 metric tons of raw chrysotile asbestos from Brazil and Russia. Now, Brazil, as Gopal mentioned, has a ban. Over the last 17 years, I think this is also important. The industry, as profitable as they have been, there is a decline in mining and use. And I've testified next to Robert Nolan, who's actually on this chat. Robert Nolan, and I'm sorry to point you out, Robert, but seeing your names makes me remember when we testified in front of the U.S. House of Representatives, we were talking about all asbestos fibers being a carcinogen. And you were still carrying water, I feel, for the industry, talking about how chrysotile obviously wasn't as dangerous. That is anything but the truth. We call that the ABC defense, anything but chrysotile. So Arthur, Barry, and others, we are working together with Congress to ban all 6 fiber types, as well as winchite and richterite, and improve chemical data reporting, which is very important, because if companies have to produce documentation as to who's importing asbestos, where is it being used, we believe that will help become a de facto ban. And also, it is more than just the worker, not to negate, because when workers work with asbestos, their human rights, but also the rights of their families, are often violated, because the worker may come home with contaminated clothing and hug their children, and the wife may wash the clothing. So it is a long-term disaster we're trying to mitigate and eliminate. Environmental exposure, as Silvana has spoken about, and so has Gopal, we find in the United States to be one of the biggest areas of contamination. We know when 9/11 towers fell, hundreds of tons of asbestos were released, but it's Superfund sites, it's legacy exposure in homes, schools, and workplaces that needs to be addressed. So clearly, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, and we've had a lot of astronauts in the last 2 weeks, to understand that if you import asbestos, This problem doesn't go away easily. And we feel in the United States what we do matters, but what we don't do matters even more, like we haven't banned asbestos. So I apologize to Savannah, Brazil, India, and other countries that we in the United States have set a very bad record for protecting public health and obviously honoring human rights and seeking justice. Barry, I'd like to shift this conversation halfway through and focus on justice. And I know Silvana and Eudice and others would justice when you have an empty chair at your table or a daughter who can't dance with her husband at her wedding. Justice is never sought through financial compensation. However, ADAO believes very strongly that we should protect asbestos victims' civil rights. And by way of these trials, I think this is important, Barry. The companies, when you have a plaintiff, there is so-called discovery that goes on, and you get information from some of the companies who have obviously made people sick and killed them. That information helps us to write papers, work with Congress, and pursue justice because of so-called discovery. Can you share a little bit about how you have been working within the United States and around the world on aspects of ensuring civil justice can continue?
Well, the American legal system provides that people can bring a lawsuit against a company that sold a product that harmed the individual using the product, that the company is responsible for that harm if they didn't warn the product user about it, based on what an expert would have known about the hazards of that type of product. And in the course of all these many hundreds of thousands of lawsuits in the United States, the companies have been obliged to open their records and share documents about their historic knowledge about the hazards of asbestos. And this is what Linda refers to as legal discovery. And so in the process of legal discovery, we've gotten an extraordinary amount of information from companies about knowledge about the lethality of asbestos going back to the 1920s, about studies that they sponsored that were suppressed, showing that asbestos caused cancer in experimental animals, about the manipulation of published articles, many articles going back to the 1930s by the industry lawyers. Actually, the correspondence between the lawyers and the authors of the articles has emerged. And so it's been quite an amazing story. Even after the cover-up period came to a close and people started learning more about asbestos in the 1970s, then the response of the companies in dealing with the problem shifted to a defensive kind of approach in dealing with the government regulatory agencies. So for example, we've seen in legal discovery that Alcoa, a big aluminum company in the United States, had to deal with the problem that the new OSHA regulations in 1972 required that if you monitor the worker's exposure and find that it's above 10 fibers per cubic centimeter for a 15-minute period of time, you have to notify the worker about that. And you have to do it in writing within 5 days. And so that the top guy at Alcoa said to his cohorts, we'd have at least 50 cases just in Tennessee alone to have to do that. And he draws this picture of strikes and labor unrest that he imagines would occur if they told all these workers they were overexposed to asbestos, and got them to realize what that meant, because at least one of those workers would have gone to somebody who could tell them about the medical issues on asbestos. So, and then it turns out that Alcoa never did warn workers for the next 10 years about overexposure to asbestos. And so the legal discovery has shown that this is the kind of predatory behavior that some big companies engaged in, even during the era of regulation, in order to minimize their costs.
It's an excellent summary, Barry. Gopal, tell us what you're doing to ensure asbestos victims in Bihar and India. I know compensation is difficult. You fight well-funded companies. The students of Bihar reached out to me about a decade ago. They were seeking educational information and they did an amazing job. And Silvana made a remark in a written document about how it's going to be the next generation that takes over for us. The students of Bihar did a great job. They shut down those initial requests to build cement factories. Tell us what you're doing for asbestos victims as they work to seek justice, and maybe what you're doing legally to ban asbestos and stop use. You're muted, Gopal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In Bihar, yeah. In Bihar, the struggle began in the year 2010, when students recognized, based on the study of their chemistry textbooks and biology textbooks, that something which they were studied in their textbooks to be hazardous and carcinogenic, that kind of asbestos mineral fiber based factories coming up in Muzaffarpur. And there was a West Bengal based company which was proposing that plant, that factory. So the villagers of Chainpur, Bisimpur in Marwan block of Muzaffarpur in Vaishali joined, listened to the students, and they subsequently contacted me. I came back to Delhi, and being a native of Delhi, a native of Bihar, I joined the struggle and have remained in the struggle since 2010. And we almost had total victory in closing all the asbestos factories in Bihar. But then there was some hiccup recently, and one was hoping to hear the chairman of the Bihar State Pollution Control Board clarify, but he could not join us. The anti-asbestos struggle in Bihar is, I think, the first of its kind in India. In fact, one similar success happened in Odisha as well, where colleagues like Amitabh have worked with villagers to get asbestos factory closed there. But in Bihar, there has been a closure of at least 7 asbestos factories. And the last one is a factory of Ramco Industries, one of the 18 asbestos product manufacturers which are part of the cartel of the asbestos cement products manufacturers. They have got a clearance of 1 asbestos factory unit, but they are running 2 factory units, and they are in violation of Water Pollution Act. They are Water Pollution Prevention Act. They are in violation of the Air Pollution Prevention Act. This has been recognized by the State Pollution Control Board. They cancelled it. But because of a procedural lapse on the part of the authorities, they managed to get a relief from the High Court. The Bihar struggle is far from incomplete, because unless government, although the Chief Minister of the state, Mr. Nitish Kumar, announced it in July 2019 in the State Assembly, that he will not allow asbestos factories to be closed in Bihar, to be operated or set up in Bihar. So the fact is that the one which is already pre-existing prior to his announcement, that has not been closed as yet. And the Pollution Control Board chairman has recently assured us that he will take the action. Another very important part is that workers are dying in Bihar factories. Like in Ramco, at least 2 workers have died, and one of the workers' family was given a compensation of just 5,000 Indian rupees. And in fact, the civil surgeon gave a statement, in a written statement to the Bihar Human Rights Commission, that the death of a disease has happened. He was not using the word worker for the worker. He was using the word the disease has died while working while cooking for the people in the Ramco Industries. The National Human Rights Commission has also been seized with the matter for long. It got affidavits from all the states of India, and finally, for some strange reason, it took an inconsistent position that although ban was being prayed for in the light of the Supreme Court of India's verdict, in the light of the recommendation of WHO and ILO, NHRC reached a conclusion that India cannot join Rotterdam Convention PIC list for inclusion of trisulfide asbestos in the UN list of hazardous substances, citing a conflict of interest ridden study. In fact, ALEC is here in March 2011. ALEC was in New Delhi, and we had passed a New Delhi declaration. And at that meeting, ALEC had told us, drawing on the experience from Canada, that using the population of, comparing the population of Canada and India, he estimated that 50,000 people are dying every year in India because of asbestos exposure. I had filed this in the National Human Rights Commission, but all this was not paid heed to. Most recently, the National Human Rights Commission from 8th July onwards this year is seized with the issue of asbestos contaminated talcum powder. The entire North America.
Gopal, we're going to move. We're going to save talcum powder for another call. That is not, I know it's a big issue. We support that, but we really want to stay with policy in the United States that will ban asbestos.
May I say just two sentences I will just add? One is that 200 million Dalits, scheduled caste, most marginalized community of India, 79% of that 200 million lives under asbestos roofs. And they have no way of being documentation of their disease, no way of getting a compensation. Supreme Court did allow for compensation, $1/1000,000 was awarded, but documentation is not happening, and lack of documentation does not mean lack of problem. But there is no building in India, public or private, which is asbestos free. So the legacy waste asbestos and the coming asbestos usage is going to create a huge number of disease burden and also a huge number of mortalities. Thank you.
All very important points, and we're sensitive and we want to work together. Silvana, your quest for justice, when I was invited by Afiva and Fernanda and Barry to go to the Schmidt-Heine hearing, I think it was 2012, this man never showed up in person. He was tried in his absentia. He had a team of lawyers. I don't know how many, Barry, you would probably know. But ultimately, your fight for justice was recognized with a verdict of 16 to 18 years and money. The reality is we thought temporarily you had won, and we were so collectively excited. I know it has taken a really tough turn. Can you talk briefly, and it's a complicated issue, Barry, you might have to augment this. Can you talk briefly about what happened after Schmidt-Heine's verdict in 2012 and where you are today in seeking justice? Because this man, Schmidt-Heine, has been honored at Yale University in the United States. We support your struggle. We share your outrage that Schmidt-Heine is temporarily off the hook, and we stand ready to fight with you in Casale and throughout Italy and the world.
Okay.
So
I'll translate, and I think that the question will give Silvana lots of to work with. Silvana, Linda fatto una domanda chiedendo che lei spiega all'inizio il primo processo contro Schmidt-Heine e come è andato bene, ma alla fine male.
Non bene.
E adesso dove siamo adesso col secondo processo e che succede? La possibilità di vincere, il ruolo di tutti quegli avvocati da Schmidt-Heine e anche Linda dice che tutti noi siamo al fianco dei militanti di Casale Monferrato, infatti tutti gli italiani in questa lotta.
Thank you.
Un paragrafo sommario, ok?
2-3 paragrafi.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Allora, intanto i casalesi più di 30 anni si battono per la giustizia contro l'amianto. E c'erano già stati dei processi negli anni 80 e poi negli anni 90, ma non avevano avuto, soprattutto quello degli anni 90, non aveva avuto un grande esito. Poi 2009 è cominciato il maxi processo Eternit 1, in cui Stefan Schmidaini, anche con un altro imputato che poi è morto, ma Stefan Schmidaini era accusato di disastro doloso, cioè di aver volontariamente provocato un disastro ambientale, diffondendo la fibra. In questo processo, che era cominciato nel 2009, Schmidaini era stato riconosciuto colpevole e condannato a 16 anni nel primo grado, a 18 anni nel secondo grado, ma poi quando si è arrivati al terzo grado, cioè alla Cassazione, la Cassazione alla Corte Suprema ha spostato via quelle sentenze non perché non fosse colpevole. Lui è stato riconosciuto colpevole, però era passato troppo tempo e quelle pene non le ha dovute espiare. È stato detto che quelle pene non dovevano essere espiate, quella pena di 5 anni non doveva essere espiata. Questo da noi si chiama prescrizione.
Okay, so what Silvana's explained, and it's important for everybody on the call, the activists in Casale Monferrato have wanted justice in the criminal sense ever since the beginning of their struggle. They tried in the 80s, they tried in the 90s without a great amount of success. But then in 2009 began what they call the Maxi Processo, the big case, number 1 against Ethernet, against Schmidaini and a colleague. The colleague has since died. Schmidaini, as Linda's mentioned, is a multi-billionaire and extremely alive and has reinvented himself, apparently. Anyway, this first trial resulted, and again for everyone, the significance of this globally, resulted in a 16-year sentence for Schmidaini. Then at the second level, the first appeal level, I guess we'll call it, increased to 18 years. Just imagine the impunity of all these people who've exposed many, many millions to asbestos all these years, and finally someone got a big sentence. But then in the Italian Supreme Court, not because he wasn't guilty, but because of technical reasons, the case was thrown out. So the case stopped. So Silvana, okay.
Okay.
Secondo processo.
Secondo processo. Dopo quella sentenza, noi tutti fummo molto delusi e amareggiati. Ma la Procura di Torino avviò un altro processo, che è quello che oggi si chiama Eternit bis, cioè l'Eternit 2, ma con una imputazione diversa. Nell'Eternit 1 era accusato di disastro doloso, cioè di aver creato un disastro in questo territorio, mentre nell'Eternit bis, cioè nell'Eternit 2, è accusato dell'omicidio volontario di 392 persone. Di queste 392, solo 63 erano lavoratori dell'Eternit, gli altri quasi 300 erano cittadini che non hanno mai lavorato all'Eternit e che però hanno respirato la fibra che si è diffusa in città. Queste 392 vittime non sono tutte le vittime dell'amianto a Casale. Da quando si è cominciato a contarle saranno ormai più di 2000 e nel frattempo continuano ad ammalarsi almeno una cinquantina di casi nuovi ogni anno. Quindi sono ben di più di 392. Il processo è concentrato su 392.
Okay.
Okay.
So what Silvana's explaining is really the legal strategy. She says that after the defeat, the technical loss in 2012, the community, the activists were heartbroken. They wondered if anything would ever happen. But then the prosecutor in Torino found a new legal route. And now we have, we'll call it Eternit bis, like the second time around. And instead of a sort of almost like an and not an environmental charge, but one that dealt with the situation. This particular case is about homicide. It's a direct criminal case with that kind of extremely loaded language, the highest level that you could get. The case does not include all the victims of asbestos in Casale. We believe, I think she used the figure of there are as many as 2,000 victims in this small city of 35,000. And you can imagine 1 out of every 17 people or perhaps more has been touched terribly by asbestos. Every family knows somebody. Instead, it's focusing on 392 victims. Around 60 or 70 are from the workplace, the asbestos cement factory. The remainder are environmental victims. So by far the majority are environmental victims. Silvana also reported, and this is really a terrible example of the power of asbestos to stretch death through decades, that there's still around 50 new mesothelioma cases in Casale Monferrato every year. And we are now more than 30 years after the closing of that factory. Okay. I think we better un paragrafo in più perché siamo quasi alla fine.
Ok, questo sarà un processo molto lungo e molto doloroso perché ciascuna diagnosi di quelle 392 verrà esaminata dettagliatamente e i difensori vogliono assicurarsi che davvero sia mesotelioma, perché dicono che non è certo che tutte quelle morti siano mesotelioma. Che cosa abbiamo bisogno? Abbiamo bisogno di aiutarci tutti insieme, perché da sempre si è cercato di comprimere le proteste all'interno del territorio locale e fino a un certo punto sono riusciti a farlo. Adesso con internet non più, perché abbiamo la possibilità di raccontare ovunque quello che succede e quello che è successo. Noi contiamo moltissimo sui ragazzi, perché sono loro che devono continuare. Loro sono molto sensibili. Gli insegnanti li hanno aiutati a capire bene che cosa è successo. Alcuni di loro hanno avuto i nonni, i genitori, i familiari morti per l'amianto, quindi sanno bene di cosa si tratta. E quando è cominciato il processo, loro hanno lanciato un messaggio: noi ci siamo. Ecco, il messaggio deve essere questo: dobbiamo esserci, perché bisogna continuare fino a quando non sarà finita e fino a quando dell'amianto e del mesotelioma si leggerà soltanto nei libri di storia.
Okay, so she's just made a very powerful statement. It's impossible for me to be so powerful in a simple translation. Silvana's explaining that this is going to be a long and very difficult trial. Schmidaini's lawyers, this is what they do.
Gotta love money.
They're challenging, it looks like, if I'm understanding her correctly, virtually case by case, they're challenging whether it really is mesothelioma, whether the diagnosis is correct. It's just sickening, but that's what's happening. And so it will take a while. And she answers Linda's question from the beginning: what can we all do to help? And she's essentially saying that now we're in the internet age. We can receive reports on a regular basis what's happening. We need to put our eyes on this trial. We need to express our solidarity and come to their support and stand beside them. They're the older generation, and she said in this current phase of struggle, they're counting very much on the younger generation, on their children, on their grandchildren, even their great-grandchildren from these families touched by asbestos. And she said some very touching, powerful things about the way that these young people are stepping up. And for those on the internet, you might have seen some of the video, the photos of the young people saying, we will be there. It won't just be something for the history books. Sorry, I'm losing it too.
No, those are the remarks. We're more than statistics. For Marco, for Arthur, for Alan, for Marty's father, we are much more than a number in a report. And I think Silvana's way that she has framed that is very important. If you want to briefly just translate, and I want to get to close, Arthur, Alec, to translate too.
Così Silvana, Linda ha detto che noi tutti siamo con te, con I militanti, e con questi giovani, ragazzi di Casale e altre città, un momento importantissimo, la solidarietà che vuoi da noi, ce l'hai.
Thank you, Alec. So we only have a few minutes left, and this conversation could go on for a very long time. I want to make sure that for folks on this call that they know that they will receive an invitation to our conference in September 17th and 18th as our guest. On Friday, ADAO is proud to host the first ever film festival about asbestos films. It would be Breathless, The Mother, and Dirty Laundry. I know that with our human rights, quest for justice, environmental racism, we have the information that journalists in the United States and others need. And we will continue to work within the United States and around the world. I would like to suggest at the end of this, I will work with our panelists, and I'm sorry that Fernanda's not here, but I know she's here in spirit. Her work is amazing. I would like to produce a declaration, and I know this could maybe help Gopal and Silvana and Brazil. We'll produce a declaration about the simple facts about asbestos being a known carcinogen, what the World Health Trade Center has done and said in 2006, ILO Convention 162. We'll put together a simple 1 or 2 page document that we can then use within our own countries, but around the world, to ban asbestos, stop the use, and work to prevent and protect human rights, but also let those harmed, who have been harmed, who suffer, who have died, let them try, hopefully, to get some compensation. With the lawyers in the United States, that is how we get the best information out. And Barry knows better than anybody else. No country in the United States, well, I probably shouldn't say no, Barry. Most companies in the United States did not stop using it because they felt good in their heart. They stopped using asbestos because they got sued. And experts like Barry Castleman and Arthur Frank have held them responsible. So I believe collective activism is the only way we can move this forward. I'm sad that the conversation will end. There will be a video that we share live, and all of the speakers today will be able to share one major resource as well as a call to action. And then I look forward to working with Gopal, Silvana, Alec, of course, and Barry to produce a declaration from this important human rights conversation about violations and quest for civil justice. In closing, I want to thank every panelist. Silvana, you're a sister. We've hugged and cried. You will win the case. Schmidt-Heine will be held accountable. And I know people like Barry and others, and Vicky who translates, you have our support. And Gopal, tell those students in Bihar that they can count on me again and all of the other folks in Bihar to fight those companies. What they're doing is wrong. There is no safe level of asbestos exposure. All 6 fiber types, including chrysotile, cause disease and deaths. And it is unacceptable in the 21st century that we have been allowed to be held hostage by rich industry that claim asbestos is safe and can be used. And I know Barry Castleman has fought for over probably 45 years now. And with Barry's help and others, we will get this done. And to Fernanda, who's not here, you have a ban in Brazil. We look forward to celebrating the day when the ban is actually acknowledged and the US stops violating human rights by importing Brazilian asbestos to meet the needs of one chlor-alkali industry. That being said, I want to thank our panelists. Before we close, one quick question. What is your message to the United States Congress about banning asbestos? We'll start with Barry.
Well, the United States should catch up to Colombia, Croatia, South Africa, and a whole bunch of other countries that have banned asbestos. It's just ridiculous that the United States hasn't done that. And it's only because of all the damage suits by the asbestos victims that companies have stopped using asbestos in manufacturing in the United States, and yet we still continue to import asbestos and asbestos products because Congress hasn't finished the job.
Thank you, Barry. Gopal, what is your message to the US Congress? Muted. Gopal, you're muted.
I met an American judge in Dhaka and I asked him, why was the US EPA ban lifted by the US courts? And the US judge told me that when there are 9 judges on the bench, 5 judges are wiser than the 4 judges. I think the US legislature should pay heed to the original US EPA recommendation for banning it. And this majoritarianism in public health decision making does not help. It has not helped in some 70 countries, and it does not behove the stature of United States of America to continue to be the only developed country to continue to use asbestos. It is high time the Ban Asbestos America Act is brought into force so that others can also learn from what US EPA did long back. Thank you.
Thank you, Gopal.
I'll
Alec,
translate it. I'll translate for Silvana.
but I also would like, out of respect to you, your work in Canada, and thank you for being an amazing translator, ask Silvana what is her message to the US Congress, and then Alec from Canada, if you would like to give us your message, that's great too.
Ok, great. Silvana, Linda vuole un messaggio corto per finire la discussione, un messaggio dal movimento italiano che deve fare il governo americano adesso riguarda l'amianto.
Allora, qualche anno fa Bruno Pesce, che voi conoscete, aveva definito tutti gli attivisti messi insieme la multinazionale delle vittime dell'amianto. Gli attivisti italiani, europei, indiani, americani, canadesi, brasiliani, tutti insieme formiamo la multinazionale delle vittime dell'amianto. Con l'esempio dell'Italia, l'esempio partito da Casale, dovrebbe servire a tutti per non rinunciare a continuare a perseguire questa giustizia che qui si continua a insistere per avere. E la che potete fare è che anche lì voi cerchiate dei giovani perché portino avanti queste battaglie. Cosa possa fare la giustizia americana? Io non lo so, perché è diversa da quella italiana. Noi qui cerchiamo che venga riconosciuto prima di tutto un principio di responsabilità, un torto che è stato commesso, ed è stato commesso per un comportamento, per una condotta sbagliata, per una condotta criminale. In America la giustizia avviene in maniera diversa, ma quello che conta è che comunque sappiano che questi comportamenti non devono più verificarsi e che comunque parlandone continuiamo a mantenere l'attenzione perché non possa avvenire come è avvenuto in passato e passare tutto sotto silenzio. Questa multinazionale dell'amianto deve combattere unita in tutti i paesi del pianeta, come si sta facendo adesso.
It's a beautiful statement. I can hardly do justice to it, but she's quoting an activist from Casale Monferrato, Bruno Pesce. He said, they have their multinationals. Well, we have our multinational, the multinational of the asbestos movement from every country. We must all stand together. We mustn't give up. We must pass on this struggle to the younger people. And we have to speak to the American people and say it's high time that you ended this illegal refusal to protect people and their lives and follow the rest of the world and move forward with a ban on asbestos. And I'll finish off with Canada. In Canada, after decades of struggle that I was part of and others on this call like Judith Goldberg and others were part of, we did win a national ban on asbestos. It has a few holes in it that we're working on, but we won a ban. And I think what we learned was that you should never lose hope. Certainly there were a lot of occasions in Canada where we could have lost hope or did even come close to losing hope, but we never gave up. We stuck to it. And I think maybe you've got your moment in the United States where you're going to win too. Thank you.
I hope you're right, Alex. So Ellen's comment will be the very last. Ellen is a tireless volunteer. She serves on our board. She works on our conference. Many of you have gotten emails from Ellen, my dear friend and board member. Ellen, what would you like to say to Congress about the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act?
I am hoping they come to their senses and understand the deadly mineral that this has affected so many thousands and thousands of people. So I'm hoping that this comes to fruition. And I thank all of the panelists and participants in this session. Your voices are so important and will continue the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for your leadership. That closes the conversation, and I look forward to sending you a wrap-up email, a link to the recorded video, and my thanks to Silvana, to Barry, to Alex, to Gopal, and of course, I wish Fernanda could have been here, and Dr. Groshi. So this concludes the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Grazie mille.
Grazie mille. Ciao. Bye, everybody.
Ciao, ciao.
Grazie, Silvana.
Grazie a voi, grazie a te.
Grazie, Silvana.